much of this bill is fixing up all the blunders of the past, quite a substantial amount. Look, you know, it's under this government and Labor predecessors. And I note that there are Labor members on the backbench laughing about it, but there are people, constituents, who relied on this government and Labor predecessors who legislated to give them a protection, promising them they'd have protection, and they stuffed it up. And now there are constituents out there who've had to pay out of their own pockets tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the mistakes of this Labor government. So the measure here before the parliament to provide some certainty around the right of constituents to be able to install these solar panels on their properties where there may be a strata situation or a development covenant is to really address what was previously promised. So we have heard about that example from north of Brisbane where a lady had installed solar panels in good faith and believing that the legislation that Labor government had said would give her protection, she found it didn't, and has ended up in a legal situation having to defend herself against this failed
Member for Logan will cease his interjections.
I think that we recognise that legislation, when governments promise that it's providing a constituent with protection, should do exactly that. And we have to raise the issue about how good is the consultation process under Labor governments, be it with the legislation or the regulations that they sit under these pieces of legislation. And unfortunately, as we're seeing with this bill before the parliament, not good enough. And in the parliament we should be able to raise these issues and have the opportunity of doing that. I'll come to the issue of the regulatory power that's being proposed that will remove some measures that should otherwise be in primary legislation that would be scrutinised appropriately by parliament, rather by a regulatory measure that doesn't have the same level of scrutiny. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to address this issue of combustible cladding, and it is a serious issue, and we certainly agree about how serious the matter of combustible cladding is. And that shocking, that destructive and tragic Grenfell Tower disaster that occurred in the UK with a loss of life, that also then sent a shockwave not only around the UK but around the world, and certainly here in Australia, when people realised there was these faulty building materials that had the potential to see great loss of life because of their flammability. We know that the building industry has had issues with regard to procurement chain and quality access to materials recently, but this particular material failure that had been used quite extensively here in Australia is one that is still having a great impact, potentially for those who have it upon their buildings, and others are trying to find the appropriate rectification. And I note the contribution of the member for Surfers Paradise, who presented the situation in his own electorate, where there are a great number of high-rise buildings and the difficulty that constituents have in that process of rectification, having a process to see a rectification and to get themselves at the end of the road able to live safely but also know that their buildings are compliant. But I want to also reference the fact that on the government's website, where they list some of the government buildings, that there is in fact one in Maroochydore, the Micah Hearn building, and that particular building has been listed as one that also had an issue with the combustible cladding. And I want to quote from this website, and I'll table the printout of this website as it's only been updated in the last few days.
Pause the clock. Pause the clock. Member for Nicklin, are you in your correct seat to be interjecting? Member for Maroochydore, you have the call.
Thank you. This website was last updated on the 17th of May 2022, and it lists the Micah Hearn building, which is a government-owned high-rise in Maroochydore, And I do note that under this
Member for
website...
Nicholson will cease his interjections.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do note that there are risk management procedures that have been put in place and that there are a number of buildings that are still to be rectified or there's a process in place. And I acknowledge that this list is on the website, but it says interim risk mitigation measures have commenced with staff and building occupants notified. The facility is subject to potentially modified Queensland Fire and Emergency Services QFES response, where rectification works have been completed to the satisfaction of a specialist fire engineer. Such facilities will be removed from the schedule of notified government building sites. It is the government's priority to ensure the health, safety and wellbeing of Queensland residents and visitors where they live, work and visit. And I'll table that document because it has obviously had an impact across a number of significant government sites, and I would welcome any update from the Minister in respect to the Micah Hearn building, which is a building that houses government departments in Maroochydore, and so that we can continue to have eyes on the work that's being undertaken in that particular location. But following on from my colleague, the member for Surfers Paradise, I'll table that document. Thank you. There are a lot of buildings also in the private sector, and there are still major concerns about how to see those buildings rectified. And I understand that the process of doing that technically also has to be married with body corporates, with individual owners, with certifiers, fire engineers, certainly a range of professional people who have to provide that pathway, but government has to play a lead role in that. And I certainly seek the Minister's advice as to the status of when we will see greater resolution and how many buildings are still in that prone position, and a situation where people are living the nightmare of having owning their homes, particularly, that are captured by the need for an appropriate rectification so they can be safe, but also see the ability to buy and sell their properties knowing that it's no longer encumbered by this faulty blight upon the building. I want to come back to the regulatory issue, and this comes to the matter of this government avoiding scrutiny. There has been a process of a lot of legislation under this Labor government and some of their Labor predecessors having to come back in here to be fixed, and at the heart of that is a lack of appropriate consultation. So there was reference made by the parliamentary committee about the concern about certain measures being taken out of legislation and putting into a regulatory provision, and that there were stakeholder groups such as the Law Society, such as other stakeholders who submitted to the committee process who said this isn't appropriate. And we agree it isn't appropriate. I do support there being appropriate mechanisms in law to keep people safe, to ensure people are paid. But I also support the scrutiny of this parliament and not having matters put into regulation that should be in primary legislation. And this comes back again to the issue of consultation.
Order,
the Minister
members.
has said in his response, and which he tabled during his contribution earlier, that he will be doing targeted consultation. He'll be doing targeted consultation. But actually, in his tabled response to the committee, he also talked about how they're going to have a relevant regulatory impact assessment. Now, that's not a RIS, that's not a regulatory impact statement that is understood under the better regulatory practices. It's something different again. And I just looked at that and I thought, oh, that's not an accident, that they're not actually going to have a proper regulatory impact statement. And there is a problem with the consultation that this government does. There's a problem with the fact that they rush legislation through, and often the people who pay the price are constituents who are faced with legal bills for having trusted this government to have got it right. The building industry and all those who need a home, who need affordable housing, whether it's private or public sector housing, affordable housing, need to have a pipeline where there is transparency, where there's regulation that obviously supports safety and supports a fair go, But there has been a flaw in the way this government's done its consultation. It's putting more pressure and cost back on
This
consumers.
time has expired.